Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this Parkland 101 presentation about the highly interesting topic of carbon compliance in both Canada and the US. Jamie McDermott is going to present for Canada, and I will step in and present for the US after she is done. So at this point, I'm going to let Jamie take it away. And if you have questions, you can post them as usual, and we'll address them at the end of our presentation. Okay, thank you very much. And I'll let Jamie take it away.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to start with a Canadian carbon compliance overview. It is super exciting and a lot of information. I'll also apologize up front because I am a lot less dynamic presenter than Catherine, so I may put you a little bit of sleep at the beginning, but don't worry, Catherine will perk you up at the end. I'll start this presentation now. So the purpose of climate change regulations in Canada is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming. So the federal government has put in a benchmark for national emissions. Their target is 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. There's three main streams-ish of regulations in Canada. They do kind of cross a little bit, but first we have renewable fuel regulations that simply set a minimum renewable fuel content required in petroleum fuel placed in the market. So this is Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and kind of Alberta. These provinces with just an RFR program are also subject to the federal fuel charge to meet the benchmark that the Canadian government has put in place. Then we have regulations, provinces that have a low carbon fuels plus a renewable fuel standard. So in addition to a minimum renewable content, regulations award credits for supplying fuels with CIs below a set target, and this targets typically decrease yearly or every few years. These provinces are BC, Ontario, Quebec, and then the federal CFR. So just a note, the carbon intensity is the amount of CO2 emitted when a fuel is burned. It is often calculated based on a life cycle analysis. And then we have regulations that set a price on carbon, thereby making lower carbon intense products more desirable, such as the cap and trade program in Quebec. I'm mainly going to focus on Canada supplies reporting in each province, since they do report in all provinces, and then I'll do a summary of our other entities in Canada. So the first province I'm going to go through is Saskatchewan. So they have a minimum annual average of 2% biofuel content in diesel and a 7.5% ethanol content in gasoline. So the obligation to meet the mandate is based on companies who have been classified as eligible distributors by the government. So Parkland was identified as an eligible distributor via a 2015 directive, although it technically should not be under the regulations for the wording. Parkland's obligation, therefore, is imports plus purchases minus exports. So Parkland typically cannot meet the 2% diesel mandate because we're not a producer or a blender in the province. So we have an arrangement with our Saskatchewan suppliers for the transfer of notional renewable liters free of charge to meet the mandate on our purchases. Parkland needs to then balance imports and exports to meet the mandate. So the import of unblended diesel could cause a deficiency, and the unbalanced export between unblended and blended diesel could cause a deficiency in Saskatchewan for Parkland. Manitoba is also just a renewable fuels program. The mandate is a minimum of 5% biofuel content in diesel and 10% ethanol content in gasoline. They all across Canada of the provinces. So the obligations to meet the mandate is based on who's the tax collector, meaning the last place supplier in the market. This contrasts with all other programs where it's first placed in the market. Parkland's obligation in Manitoba are based on imports plus purchases minus exports. So as in Saskatchewan, Parkland does not blend in Manitoba and can only meet the mandates through balancing imports and purchases and exports. Manitoba does not have a mechanism in the regulation for the notional transfer of renewable fuel between suppliers. Therefore, if Parkland imports or purchases non-blended gasoline, it will become non-compliant with the gasoline mandates because it's at 10%, and most gasoline is at 10% ethanol. And if Parkland does not lift enough 10 plus HDRD blended fuel within the province to balance our non-blended winter diesel, imports and purchases, Parkland will be non-compliant with the diesel mandate. So diesel balancing in Manitoba is extremely important to avoid another penalty and restricting the product type during blending season our transport companies can lift is vital. So we did end up paying a penalty in 2022 because we were unbalanced, and it could be quite costly sometimes. Alberta. So Alberta is an RFR mandate. So the annual average is 2% in biofuel content in diesel and 5% ethanol content in gasoline. But they do have the addition or an additional requirement where the biofuel content is only allowed to be counted if it has an Alberta validation certificate. This certificate states that the renewable fuel content meets or is below a GHG emission intensity threshold. So they do add another factor onto their requirements. The obligation to meet the mandate is with first place supplier in the province. Parkland is not obligated on in-province purchases, but it is obligated on the fuel imported into the province or blended at boating as first placed. Parkland can import gasoline into Alberta without taking a compliance hit, but the importation of non-blended diesel will create a deficiency. This is because Parkland does not blend in the province diesel. So the regulation in Alberta is actually up for renewal by 2027. Moving on to the second category of regulations in Canada is where you have a low carbon fuel plus a renewable fuel. So we add in our carbon intensity factors. In Ontario, the Ontario obligation is first place in the market. So Parkland is obligated on imported fuel and fuel blended and sold from its transloads and truck racks in Ontario. Or terminals, that should be, sorry. For 2024, gasoline first placed in the Ontario market must have a minimum of 10% content, and the bio-based content must emit an average of 45% lower GHG emissions than standard gasoline. This works out to be a CI for ethanol in 2024, about 46.1 or lower will get us there. So the percent ethanol required increases to 11% in 2025, 13% in 2028, and 15% in 2030. In 2030, the renewable content must emit 50% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than fossil fuel gasoline on a life cycle basis. So as the percentage goes up, either you blend more ethanol into your fuel or you have to purchase a lower CI ethanol to blend. Volumes of mid and premium gasoline are excluded from the regulation. CBOB purchases, as if it's sold as a blend stock, is also excluded from the regulation. For 2024 to 2030, diesel, first place in the Ontario market, must have a minimum average of 4% content and must emit 70% lower greenhouse gas emissions than the standard diesel. This works out to be a CI of biodiesel for about 27.6 or lower. So their mandate on the diesel component, on the biodiesel component, doesn't change up until 2030. Diesel that will be used for the purposes of generating power in aircraft or in a furnace or boiler to produce heat are excluded from the regulations. And we can usually capitalize on the sale of some greener diesel renewable fuel, which could be about 80 cents a liter. In Quebec, so they started a renewable fuels program in January 1st, 2023. The obligated party is the Quebec manufacturer, they call them, and this is who supplies a wholesaler or retailer and or an importer that supplies a wholesaler or retailer in Quebec or retails gas or diesel fuel. So gasoline, the annual percent of renewable fuel content is 10% for 2023 and 24, goes up to 12% in 2025, 14% in 2028, and 15% in 2030. So this is also based on a CI, so you can either blend more ethanol into your gasoline or you can use a lower carbon intense ethanol in your fuel as a blend. So exclusions in Quebec are premium, supply to aircraft, boat, or ship supplies, purposes other than combustion. And Quebec actually has their province divided into 3 zones. There's an A, a B, and then a non-exclusion zone. So exclusion A zone is far north of Quebec, so it will always be, so deliveries to that region of Quebec will be excluded from the regulation. There is an exclusion B, which will end at the end of this year. The diesel mandate, the annual percent of renewable fuel content is 3% in 2023, 5% starting in 2025, and 10% in 2030. So exclusions are supplying heating apparatus, aircraft, boat, ship, purposes other than combustion. And they also have the exclusion zones where exclusion A is northern Quebec, and it'll always be excluded, and then B ends again at the end of this year. So Parkland is classified as a distributor on imports to Quebec and a credit creator for the blending at Montreal East Terminal. Main concern for supply is through imports via Ontario bulk plants. So an inventory balance of fuel in and fuel out must be completed to determine the original supplier in Ontario for CI info. So we need to know the renewable fuel content going into the bulk plants and then figure out the renewable content coming out of the bulk plants into Quebec.
So Jamie, exclusion zones can still generate, they're just not obligated, right?
I can't, where does I'm sorry, I can't, yes. So you can, I'll have to go back because we can, whatever's in there is completely excluded and they don't want to, sorry, I'll have to come back to you for
I don't want to disrupt your flow. This is a bit in the weeds, so let's keep it generic.
Yeah. So like, I mean, so they're trying to hinder like people, so fuel moving across these zones. So they want it produced in the zone and sold in the zone for the exclusion, for the exclusions. But there is a few rules in moving from place to place between these zones.
You can take that offline. Yeah.
Sure. So we're going to go to the BC low carbon regulations. So the regulation requires fuel suppliers to reduce the average carbon intensity of their fuel annually to achieve 30% reduction by 2030. So a new act and regulation came out January 1st, 2024. New requirements, notable new requirements is for renewable and low carbon jet fuel requirements. So increasing carbon intensity reduction targets leading to a 10% reduction by 2030, 2024, and 2025. Reduction target is 0%, meaning supply is reportable, but no debits incurred. The renewable fuel requirements actually begin in 2028, which is 3% by 20, gets to 3% by 2030. Maximum penalties per liter shortfall is an automatic penalty of $600. Now, new administrative penalties have been added for contraventions of no greater than $1 million and or imprisonment up to 6 months. So they fortified these regulations. Exports are now reported and credits associated with exports must be canceled. So the LCFS has 2 main requirements. They have an annual carbon intensity target, which means the regulation sets increasingly stringent carbon intensity reduction targets each year, applicable to the transportation fuels and prescribed non-transportation fuels, which they have prescribed forklifts. The minimum renewable content, and a minimal renewable content requirement. So the regulation requires 5% annual average renewable content in gasoline and 4% renewable content in diesel. Application to all, and this is applicable to all reportable fuels. So Parkland Corporate is obligated on imported fuel, and it is obligated on the fuel blended within province at Ashcroft and Terrace as first place into the province. If importing blended fuel, the biofuel content must be known and a valid BC fuel code must be supplied by the supplier for this content. If importing unblended fuels, then a compliance cost must be considered in the pricing to our customers. So I've thrown in this slide, which is just an overview and a summary of all the renewable fuel percent mandates and where they go for up till 2030, if you feel like you need to refer back. The last type of the provincial regulations is Quebec also has a cap and trade regulation. So the cap and trade is an economic trading system where emission allowances are sold by the government via auctions or other participants through private sale to obligated parties that require the allowances to meet their yearly emission cap set by the government. Obligated parties are entities that emit 25,000 metric tons for Quebec or more of CO2 equivalent a year, or distributes greater than 200 liters of fuel in Quebec via first place sale into the province. Parkland is a registered fuel distributor in the program. This is the third-party audit program. The Quebec market is linked with California market and soon to be Washington. So any fuel that Parkland purchases within Quebec is the supplier's obligation as first place, not Parkland. The first place supplier must cover the cost of emission credits at the time of sale prior to knowing the actual cost of the credits. A cost is estimated based on the results of the most recent auction price for allowances. It is included in the rack price from the supplier and passed down to customers. Parkland is obligated on its imported fuel into Quebec as first place. Parkland must purchase enough credits to cover 100% of the emissions created by the fuel it imports into QC, into Quebec. Parkland needs to pass this cost to its customers. So just to give you an idea, the most recent Quebec auction closed at $41.5 per allowance, which is about 10 cents a liter, and then for gasoline, and then 12 cents a liter for diesel. We're going to move on to the federal program. So the federal clean fuels regulation is new. It started mid-2022, where we could create credits, and then the obligation started in 2023. So the CFR takes a performance-based approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. The regulations are designed to incentivize innovation and adoption of clean technologies and expand the use of low carbon intensity fuels throughout the economy. The regulation requires primary suppliers to gradually reduce the carbon intensity or the amount of pollution from the fuels they sell for use in Canada over time, leading to a decrease in approximately 15% below 2016 levels in the carbon intensity of gasoline and diesel used in Canada by 2030. So a primary supplier is defined as a supplier who owns, leases, operates, controls, or manages a fuel production facility in Canada in which gasoline or diesel is produced, or imports gasoline and diesel into Canada. So primary suppliers can comply with the CFR in multiple ways. We have compliance category 1, so you can undertake projects that reduce the life cycle CI of fossil fuels. So this, for example, is our co-processing of fuels, falls under this category. Compliance category 2 is supply of Canadian market with low carbon fuels such as ethanol, HDRD, and biodiesel. And then compliance category 3 is supply of fuel or energy to advanced vehicle technologies. So we are our EV chargers fall under compliance category 3 for credit creating. A CFR credit represents a life cycle emission reduction of 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. During each compliant period, primary suppliers must use the number of credits necessary to meet the reduction requirement. Compliance credits can either be created by primary suppliers or transferred to them by other registered creators. The regulation also contains a volumetric obligation. So at least 5% of the volume of the pool of gasoline must be displaced by an equivalent volume of gasoline of ethanol. And then at least 2% of the volume of primary suppliers' diesel pool must for each period, compliance period, be displaced by equivalent volume of a diesel replacement, so HDRD, biodiesel. A few notable exclusions from the pool that's obligated. So if it's sold or delivered for use other than combustion, it's excluded. If it was sold or delivered for use in a marine vessel that has a non-Canadian port as its destination, if it was sold or delivered for use for non-industrial purposes in a geographic area that is served by neither an electrical distribution network that is subject to the standards of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, nor a natural gas distribution system. So this is mostly the North, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories. Or if it was sold or delivered for the purpose of space heating, it's excluded from the regulations. So I'll just do a brief summary now of all of Parkland's entities in Canada and their activities. So Parkland Corporate, Canada Supply, so no Canadian production, no Canadian imports, and provincial purchases, interprovincial fuel movements, and they blend in Alberta, BC, Ontario, and Quebec. So we have no federal obligations or credit generation, because there's no activity that crosses the Canadian border. Parkland Corporate, on the behalf of the EV entities, does create credits under the CFR for electricity used to charge vehicles. Obligation under the provincial program mainly occurs upon import of fuel into the province. Parkland Corporate is a reporter into all provincial programs across Canada. So we are also a credit generator in Alberta, BC, Ontario, and Quebec for blending activities. The addition of renewables to petroleum fuel creates a benefit under most provincial programs, or all provincial programs. Parkland Refining, so they are a Canadian import, they are a Canadian producer, and they are a producer and blender in BC. So the petroleum fuel, so importing into Canada producing in Canada makes PRBC obligated under the federal CFR. So renewables, importing to Canada, and CoPro makes PRBC a credit generator under the federal CFR. And then producing and blending in BC makes PRBC obligated and a credit generator in the BC program. So Elbow River is a Canadian importer, interprovincial fuel movements, and blends in Ontario. For petroleum fuel, importing into Canada makes ERM obligated under the federal CFR. For renewables, importing to Canada makes ERM a credit generator under the federal CFR. And then a provincial reporter they are a provincial reporter for the transfer of renewables in BC and Alberta, and then provincially obligated in Ontario and Quebec. And they are a credit generator in Ontario for their blending activities. It looks like it's Catherine's time. So now it's time to perk up.
Okay, so I am just going to share my screen here. Go and share. Can you see it? All right.
Nope, not.
Share. There we go. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Kat.
Okay, so you're good? Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, awesome. Okay, so just to be different, I actually did my presentation in reverse to Jamie's. I'm starting with federal and then moving into state. So let me just flip this over to presentation. There we go. Okay, so here's my agenda. So we're going to start with federal, and then we're going to move into state. So in the US, the federal program is managed from a volumetric perspective. We don't deal with CIs in terms of reporting. So suppliers do have to get CIs in place so that they can acquire a RIN, which is an acronym for a Renewable Identification Number. So I'm going to walk you through what a RIN is, who needs them, what they're used for, and how we get them. And then we'll move into the state program. So there's three states that have, currently there's three states that have low carbon and GHG programs: California, Oregon, and Washington, all in West. And in each state, as I mentioned, there's two programs. There's a GHG program, and California and Washington both have a cap and trade / cap and invest system, which is more or less the same. And then in Oregon, they have their own way of handling GHG, and they call their program the Climate Protection Program. And I'll get into the weeds about why Oregon is different. And then I have a slide for Canada versus US just for a comparison. And then we'll have that Q&A section at the end for both Canada and US if you've got questions. So renewable identification number, all of the federal reporting and management for carbon on the federal level in the US is handled by the EPA. And it requires the transferring and generation of a RIN, Renewable Identification Number. And they're basically credits that the US EPA uses to track and enforce compliance with the renewable fuels mandates set by the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard in the US. RINs are essentially records of individual batches of renewable fuel being blended into the US gasoline and diesel pools. It is essentially a serial number that's attached to a batch of biofuel for the purpose of tracking its production. So long story short, without just reading the slide, which you can do on your own, basically, if you've got a refined fuel, you are going to create an obligation. In order to satisfy that obligation for the import of that refined fuel, so diesel or gasoline into the US market, you're going to need a RIN to satisfy the imports on a volumetric basis. If you are importing a renewable fuel, then you're going to generate or you're going to acquire a RIN. So a renewable fuel gets you a RIN and a refined fuel costs you a RIN, basically. So there's three RIN buckets that are applicable to Parkland and its US subsidiaries. The first bucket is, as I mentioned, RINs associated with ethanol, biodiesel, and E10 that's transferred to USA customers, sold to or separated, and then retired when a biofuel is exported to Canada. So if I buy ethanol from a US supplier and then export it to Canada, I have to retire that RIN because there's no RIN program in Canada. If I import ethanol into the US, I will get a RIN with it, typically. Now you can separate the RIN, but that gets into more details and I'm sure that you want to hear about. But you will acquire a RIN with a biofuel and you'll need a RIN for a refined fuel. So that brings me to number two bucket. Refined fuel creates an obligation called an RVO, a renewable volume obligation. And it's created when importing diesel, gasoline, CBOB, RBOB, butane or pentane blending in the US, and refined fuel redesignation. So our US supply office, they do redesignation of ECA, which is marine fuel, and they redesignate that diesel for domestic use. Well, that comes with an obligation. So you need RINs to satisfy that RVO. The third bucket is RIN trades to capitalize on price differential between types of RINs. So our traders can look at, look at the RIN pricing in the US market. And as it fluctuates, they may decide that they're going to buy more of one kind of RIN and sell another kind of RIN to satisfy our RVO or to capitalize on additional inventory that we've got in our property. So if we've got an excess amount of, say, D6 RINs and the price for D6s has skyrocketed, they may want to sell that and then they make some money off of those additional RINs. I have another slide that explains that a little bit more. Fourth bucket, Elbow River Marketing USA, Parkland US Supply Corp, and Parkland USA Corporation. Those are the three entities in the US that manage RIN transactions for the different activities that they do, whether they're blending, redesignating, or importing or exporting. To get a RIN, a bio or a renewable fuel supplier must identify a feedstock and generation process. Each RIN is specific to that bio or renewable fuel. Our entities, Elbow River, Parkland US Supply, Parkland USA Corp, we don't generate RINs. We purchase renewable fuels that will come with the RIN. We don't generate those. So the generation of RINs isn't something that we manage. Once upon a time, we actually handled the generation of RINs for an ethanol supplier, but that deal is done. So we don't do that anymore. So here's your different kinds of RINs. A D3 and a D7 is a cellulosic biofuel. So we call the D7 a unicorn. We don't see that type of RIN very often. And it's called a unicorn because of the way that it nests, which is a mathematical word for explaining how RINs apply to obligation. And you'll see that on the next slide, I believe. D3s, for renewable volume obligation, you always have to have D3s in your inventory. That's non-negotiable, it's required. Then a D4 is for a biomass-based diesel, and D5 is an advanced biofuel. So if you're making, I don't know, ethanol from some advanced method, such as I've listed here, heating oil or biogas, sugarcane ethanol, that can generate a D5 RIN, and then a D6 for renewable fuel, which is corn ethanol. And the D6 is the most common type RIN that you see in the market. So this slide just shows you how you translate your RINs to your obligation. So I mentioned nesting earlier, which is what we call RIN math, and it allows for 20% of the previous year's RINs to apply to current year. So for 2024, I can use 20% of 2023 RINs to satisfy my RVO. We have a calculator that will tell us how many RINs of each category we need to satisfy our obligation. So those RINs are either traded, they have to be a separated RIN. So if I buy a gallon, a US gallon of ethanol, I will get one assigned RIN to go with that, that molecule with those volumes. In order for me to trade them, I have to separate that RIN. So I need a vehicle to do it, which is blending or exporting. Once the RIN is separated, it can be traded and used for obligation. So the RINs are either traded or received with the renewable fuel sales, meaning assigned. An assigned RIN must be separated before it can be traded and then retired for RVO. So the RIN ratio is depends on the type of renewable fuel. A D6 RIN is a 1-to-1. So is a D5 and a D3, and D4 is 1 RIN to 1.5 US gallon. So that's your biodiesel RIN. So this is just a little screenshot just showing the platform that we use to manage the RIN application and the renewable volume determination for the EPA. So it's all web-based, and we have a number of people within Parkland that have access to this platform, and they will go in from accounting to traders to risk and see what our obligation is at any point and what our RIN inventory is. And then I send out quarterly reports as well that update one and all who want to know what our obligation is and how many RINs we have in each category. So we are always ahead of and on top of per quarter what that obligation is. So when we get to the end of the year, we have enough RINs to retire to our obligation, depending on what our activity was for the year. So that's federal. Now we'll move into the states. I'm moving along here. Maybe I should talk slower. Okay. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, there are 2 programs in each green state. I cannot emphasize this enough. When I'm talking to people who work in the green states, meaning states that have programs in place already, this often gets lost somewhere in translation. So 2 programs. One is a low carbon program and one is a GHG program. So in California, they call it the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, LCFS, and they have a cap and trade program for the GHG obligation. In Oregon, they have a clean fuel program, which is their version of low carbon program, and they just call it something different. And the climate protection program, which is their GHG obligation. They don't have a cap and trade program in Oregon. In Washington, they have a clean fuel standard, which again is Washington's version of low carbon program, and a cap and invest for GHG obligation. I love the states because, like the provinces, everybody's got to call it something slightly different. And they've got little differences and little tweaks between them all. So it creates for a requirement for highly intelligent people, such as ourselves, to manage all this reporting, tongue in cheek. Okay, so California, Oregon, and Washington, their credit generation for their clean or their low carbon programs, they're all about the same. And this is just a mathematical breakdown where you can figure out what your obligation is based on whatever credits and deficits you have against the CI standard for the low carbon program. At the end of the day, where Parkland and its entities need to be ahead of is the importing into the states, the exporting into the states. So similar to the federal program, you create an obligation on a low carbon program by importing a refined fuel into the state. All of these low carbon programs have the same objective. They want to get rid of the refined fuel, so they are thereby lowering their emission output, and they want to increase the renewable fuel. So if you import a refined fuel into a green state, you create an obligation. If you import a renewable fuel into a green state, you create a credit. So conversely, if you export a refined fuel out of the state, like gasoline or diesel, you create a credit because you're taking out the refined fuel. If you export a renewable fuel out of the state, you create a deficit because you are removing the renewable fuel out of the state. So when we're doing our reporting, we're always considering what the cost of importing that refined fuel is, considering whether we can pass that obligation on to our counterparty. And we look at how we're distributing into the state. Is it being delivered into a bulk system or to an end user? So all these little nuances that go back to the reporting, outlining our obligation and what we're responsible for. So that's a low carbon in a nutshell. Here in this slide, I'm talking about the deadlines. We do quarterly reporting into California, Oregon, and Washington, and those are the deadline dates. So my next quarterly reporting deadline is December 31st. That's for Q3. In early January, I'll send out a quarterly update to one and all and say, hey, this is our credit generation, this is our deficit generation, and our overall position for each of the 3 US entities and each of the 3 low carbon states in the US. So it also goes on to talk about liquid fuels and non-liquid fuels. There's the low carbon program where we're concerned is really more about importing and exporting transactional sales, but the programs do go on to capture EVs, electricity, inventory in the state, it really goes on and on. But from my perspective, I'm mostly concerned about imports and transactional data in each state. We also have verification, and I should mention that even in Canada, all of our reporting, whether it's federal, provincial, state, everything has to go through verification. So we're not just reporting and relying on our own brilliance. We actually have to go through third-party verifications that analyze our raw data and make sure that what we've reported is in fact correct. And if there are errors and corrections needed, then we go back and correct them. I think Canada is before you submit, but I'm not totally sure. But in the US, on the federal and the state level, I'm verified after I report, which is not my preferred, but we are then allowed a window where we can make any corrections after verification. So all of our reporting does get verified, so we know that it's accurate moving into the next reporting year. Okay, so where are the thresholds? If we have under 10,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions per year in California and Washington, we don't have to report. If we're between 10,000 and 25,000 metric tons of emissions on the GHG, so now I'm moving into the GHG programs, then not only do we have to report, but we have to charge for our obligation. On the low carbon side, you can pass on obligation in a contractual way. Our traders can play with pricing and work with their counterparties to set up deals where they're selling diesel or gasoline or ethanol to a counterparty and pass on the obligation or the credit and achieve a price point that is satisfactory to both parties. But when it comes to GHG emissions, that cannot be contractually passed on. What you import, you are responsible for unless you're delivering into a bulk system. And then that emission obligation automatically passes on to your bulk distributor, and we're no longer responsible. So we don't even report those volumes if they're delivered into a bulk system. The IRS has a listing of bulk transport facilities. So when we're doing our reporting, we can cross-check and ensure that if we did in fact report to a bulk terminal, that it is valid and okay to not capture those volumes, because we don't want to do double reporting. Right? So the bulk distributor who owns that terminal will handle those volumes and we do not. But anything outside of that, anything that we import into that state that doesn't go to bulk terminal, we're responsible for reporting. In Washington, they require Parkland to roll up all of its entities under Parkland Corporation. Report one report in the Washington for all three of our US entities, but in Oregon and California we report individually. So Elbow will report Elbow's imports, Parkland US Supply will report Parkland US Supply's imports, and Parkland USA Corp will report Parkland USA Corp's obligations. So just an important note there that Washington does force all three to roll up together. So you might end up at some point with a much higher emission level just because it's all three entities all together, whereas the other two states right now, they only require individual reporting. So as these programs grow, as the trend of clean fuels develops in the states, potentially we could end up with 50 different programs, because each state could have their own low carbon program and their own GHG program. Obviously, from a reporting point of view, we hope that that's not going to happen, because that's a lot of different programs to report into different states and a lot of juggling of different rules and different requirements. But there is that potential. So the Canadian people, they have it a little easier than we do, because there's only 10 provinces and 3 territories, whereas the US, 50 states. So hopefully they'll group together we're hoping that the Regi states, which is 15 states on the East Coast, when they come online with their programs, we're hoping they're all going to join up and do the same program. It'll make mine and Motaz's life a lot easier. Not that I'm complaining, of course. So this slide is just a nice little easy to understand slide that talks about that terminal rack versus the bulk system. So again, like I said, if we import into one of the green states and it's delivered across the rack to a customer, we being company A, so Elbow River, US Supply, whomever is importing into that state, maintains that obligation for the GHG emission. It cannot be contractually handed over. You imported it, you delivered across the rack to your customer, that's it, that GHG is on you. But if we deliver into a bulk system, that obligation automatically moves to the bulk distributor because they are delivering to multiple counterparties. So they handle those volumes and we don't even capture them in our reporting. So just a side note, the federal program also has a GHG program. It falls under what's called Part 79. That program doesn't require any costs. There's no obligation in terms, at least today, there's no obligation in terms of needing to buy credits or satisfy. But we do have to report every single volume, every single piece of volume that's imported into the States, whether it's got an obligation or not. If it doesn't fall under the RIN program, we still have to capture what's imported, propane, butane, regardless of what it's being used for, whether it's fuels or not. So we do report what's imported on the federal program, but we don't have an obligatory piece yet. So I don't know. Now with Trump in power, probably not going to see anything over the next 4 years on the obligation piece on the federal GHG, but it might come along in the future. So we'll see. So basic principles for cap and trade in California and Washington. Regulated parties must comply with the regulation by purchasing sufficient carbon allowances at a state-held auction or through the secondary market, which captures your offsets. So you either have a compliance instrument or you have an offset to meet that obligation for your GHG emissions. And again, this is reiterated the 25,000 metric tons per CO2 equivalent. Anything at that number or above means you have an obligation and you will have to acquire your compliance instruments to meet that obligation or get a percentage of offsets depending on what the program outlines. So it costs. The applicability threshold applies to all related entities as one. You can report together under the parent or must disclose corporate relationship to the agencies. California secondary rack and marine locomotive is exempted, and in Washington secondary rack, marine locomotive, and agriculture is exempt. So this slide really just shows who's obligated. And that threshold, which I actually spoke about a little bit earlier. Now, Oregon, I had mentioned earlier, is different than Washington and California. So Oregon's program was paused by a federal judge a year ago, 2023, I think, for reasons that really have nothing to do with the inner workings of the program as much as I understand it, notification wasn't appropriate as per this judge's review, and they paused the program. They are restarting in 2025. So this slide really just shows some of the differences from the old program to the new program. So in Oregon, you don't go into our market to buy your compliance instruments, but rather the regulator themselves, the state, issues compliance instruments into a pool of the obligatory parties. So that can be a little challenging depending on when you come into the program and how much emissions you have when you come into the program. So this slide here just shows the difference, as I said, between the old program and the new. So a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Was there a change from the old program? No. Oregon still has targeted the reduction of 50% of its emissions between 2035 and between now and 2035, and then 90% by 2050. So this is to keep them on track for meaningful emission reductions. Community climate investments in Oregon is like California and Washington's offsets. So instead of compliance instruments, they have a side program where you can purchase these CCIs to meet some of your obligations. So the idea is there is that it'll promote new technologies and new renewable development, and companies who do this can then sell these CCI credits to obligatory companies, and that promotes innovation and new technologies, and it's pretty great. Is there the program evaluation? DEQ will regularly request information from Oregon's Public Utilities Commission on changes, because Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality is committed to maintaining their targets and achieving them. Yeah, I mean, we can go through all of these, but at the end of the day, the only thing that really changed from the new program, or from the old to the new, is the compliance period. So the old program was a 3-year compliance period like Washington and California, and now they're going to be a 2-year compliance period. So it starts in 25 and goes to 26, and in 2027 we have to meet any obligations. So that's kicking in next year. All right, so this slide here really is just a graphic explanation of the cap and who's in the cap for the climate protection program in Oregon. They don't have auctions like you do in California and Washington. Again, the compliance instruments are issued from the state themselves, and then there is that CCI option to purchase quote offset instruments to meet your obligation. So I know it's a lot of words and a lot to take in. At the end of the day, Washington and California have a cap and trade program, and Oregon has a compliance instrument distribution system. In a nutshell, that's a difference with those programs, and that's for the GHG. So this last slide here is just really a summary that I put together, reviewed and okayed by Jamie, the differences between the Canadian federal program and the US federal program. So the US program is volume-based. It does not require carbon intensities to be identified to generate credits or deficits, only RINs. Once a supplier of bio or renewable fuel receives a RIN for its fuel, they are not required to identify a change in feedstock. This can impact the credits and deficits generated when this bio or renewable fuel is imported into Canada. And it does create a little bit of upset between the two different countries in the import and export, more into Canada than into the US. Canadian federal and provincial programs overlap, and the feedstock given for a load of fuel imported into Canada must now match in the federal data and the provincial data. Therefore, if a feedstock changes, then CI for both federal and provincial must change and align. And the Canadian CI applications are cumbersome for the US suppliers, and the federal CFR requires substantial documentation through the chain of supply, starting at the farmer for the feedstock. Due to the lack of demand for their fuel to Canada and the difference in reporting in the US versus Canada, the US renewable fuel suppliers do not fully recognize the need for consistent CI feedstock reporting for the Canadian importer. So the Canadian regulators up here, Jamie and well, mostly Jamie, I guess, and for Elbow River's reporting, they can sometimes find some challenges when they're dealing with US fuel suppliers because of the difference in the programs. The US federal program is volume-based, the Canadian federal program is CI-based, as well as the provincial program. So it can be a little bit of a challenge. So everybody's got to be an individual. So with 5 minutes left, I guess we will open this up for questions, comments, and concerns.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We do have a question in the chat box, and they asked,
I
do
don't
federal...
hear anything, so I assume our presentation was perfect.
Oh, Catherine, could you hear me? Still on. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello? Hello? Can the audience hear me? This is...
I can hear you,
Yes.
but...
Oh, okay. So maybe Catherine jumped. Jamie, can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. So we do have a question. Do federal and state LCFS and GHG programs overlap in green states?
No, not at all. The federal program is all about the RIN, and it's just the EPA, so they don't overlap at all. The state programs are more similar to Canada's program, provincial and federal, in that they do have a CI component and a GHG. But no, the state and the federal programs do not overlap at all in the US.
Oh, thank you. We have a question. If you can just unmute yourself and you can ask. Hello, Mike. Okay. Hello?
Okay, yeah, I think we're good to go now.
I have a question. How do you stay abreast of all the different trades to know which trades have an obligation? Does every contract or confirmation come to you to where you know that, oh, that has an obligation, or does it have to be in Allegro for you to get that? Just curious how you make sure you have every trade accounted for.
So I track through, so I manage Elbow Rivers importing and exporting through the Allegro settlement data. We run a report called the Taxable Transaction Report, which is used by the tax team. So we track all of the activity on the federal level through the TTR. In fact, we track the state level transactions through the TTR, Taxable Transaction Report, out of Allegro settlement as well. That's kind of our Bible. When it comes to the US, we work intimately with logistics at US Supply, USA Corporation, down in the States, and the tax teams down there. I utilize my consultant, Trinity, who also reads the refinery reports, the terminal reports, not refinery, down in the States, and then can cross-check against our counterparties for all transactions, in tank, back-to-backs, in and outs, and so forth. So US Supply and Parkland USA Corporation, we rely on those, the logistics team and the accounting teams and the terminal reports to acquire all of the state transactions. They don't import into the US anymore, so I don't have to worry about that. But when they did, I was just advised of each trade as it happened. On the redesignation level, I work with Robbie at US Supply, who manages the redesignation on the terminal level to acquire. Obtain all the obligation for them. But for elbows, imports, exports, I use Allegro settlement data.
Any more questions from anyone? Okay, go ahead.
And then PRVC, their activity. I guess that'd be a question for Jamie then.
So I think most of PRBC's data is pulled out of their accounting system for their sales and their imports. They also, Como works with all the suppliers and stuff for reconciliations, and she has a copy of all contracts that go through and the requirements under the contracts.
Perfect.
I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. No, I was just going to
Go
say
ahead.
I'm not quite sure if we actually have, if they use Allegro on their site or not for that, for the actual trade.
No, not all the trades are in Allegro,
Yeah,
so
not.
they could.
Yeah. So yeah, it's more of a contract side.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Any more questions? Well, I have one. How does carbon compliance costs affect our financial performance and budgeting?
Well, on the Canadian side, so we actually, it is for BC and Quebec. So we have a substantial compliance cost for our activities in BC. And then we have a smaller compliance cost in Quebec. Those are the two main ones in Canada.
In the U.S., the RVO, the Renewable Volume Obligation on the federal level, is handled in the trading book. So our overall cost for Elbow River, it's fairly significant because that's what Elbow River does. They import and they export. That's their role in the state. I don't think it's too significant, to be perfectly honest with you. It's fairly balanced against revenue from the volumetric trading that they do. We've got more credits between the three entities than we do deficits typically. The traders have gotten really, really good on passing on unnecessary obligations. So on the low carbon front, we don't have a lot of cost there. And on the GHG emission level, a lot of our imports are going into bulk. So we don't carry too much cost there.
Oh, that's great. Does anyone else have any questions? No. Well, thank you so much, Catherine and Jamie. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming to our Parkland 101. I just wanted to share with you that we have these ones coming up if you want to sign up for our next Parkland 101, which is going to be on November 21st, retail marketing, and then November 26th, supply chain management. December 11th is diversity and inclusion. And if your team or anyone you know are interested in presenting next year in 2025, please email us to book your spot at talent.management@parkland.ca. Thank you so much, and I hope you have the most amazing day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.